let's settle down. Hey, we're not Canadians. Let's settle down. Oh, are we out of cookies? Okay. All right, so why don't we start in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The Lord be with you. The Lord is my shepherd. There is nothing I shall want. Fresh and green are the pastures where you give me repose. Near restful waters you lead me to revive my soul. You guide me along right path for the sake of your name. Though I should walk in the valley of the shadow of death, no evil will I fear. For you are with me. Your crook and your staff will give me comfort. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. So, thank you for whoever made the coffee. I think it was Larry Major. And somebody made cookies and devil's eggs, so thank you. So this is going to be class 3. I want to go back to the Hebrew Bible. So Genesis has one view of evil. I have to admit, I love that idea of the Yetzer Ha-Ra and Tov. Like, you have to learn how to master yourself. That's where evil in the world comes. But today, we're going to talk about wisdom literature, because one major strand of the Hebrew Bible sees evil fundamentally as a rebellion against God and good order. That's Genesis. So Genesis puts things into 3 categories. The Yetzer HaTov, selfishness, the Yetzer HaRa, good, and then also there's a 3rd category of not good, meaning it's not bad, it's just evolving. So sometimes God will say, that's not good. It means of evolving goodness. So you don't necessarily need to judge all people, because maybe they're not good, but maybe they're just not good. They're just evolving into goodness. And I think yet we overestimate their evil, other people's evil intentions, when maybe we can just say they're not good. However, the Bible also offers a counter-argument to what I said the first week about evil. And I know that sounds strange, but you get this throughout the Bible. God will say one thing, and then a couple, like in the next book, he'll say something that sounds almost completely opposite. It's not opposite, it's just a counterweight. Does that make sense? So I really don't like when somebody just takes one half a phrase from the Bible and says, God said X, which is true. But I could almost play this game with people saying, yeah, but God said the opposite too. You have to learn how to apply it. So the Bible offers a counter-argument to what I said about evil on the first week, and both are true. You just have to, so this is wisdom literature. So wisdom literature is Proverbs and wisdom, the book of Job. And wisdom literature said that evil existed before God even created human beings. And the shocking part, it says evil may exist because it's one way that God brings us to greater holiness. And so wisdom literature offers kind of this minority report as a rebuttal to the first week. And this strand talks about evil and suffering in disquieting different terms, that maybe God permits evil. Because, sometimes you'll have these people who say, if you say there's a God, if God is all good, if you even believe in God, explain why there's suffering in the world. Why there's, pickleball and baldness. Maybe God allows evil for our development. And so this strand raises questions about the nature of God's governance of human life, the mystery of God dispensing good and evil to human beings, and humanity's proper response to God, who acts in such mysterious ways as allowing evil. Why would God allow evil? Wisdom literature in the Bible suggests that the answer may be evil, may be beyond our complete understanding. That's the truth. Well, but our only response is to act with faith. So wisdom literature tries to teach us that what seems like evil, or actually even may be evil itself, may be being used by God for some mysterious purpose to turn us into greater goodness. And so wisdom literature demands great humility in regards to our answer to evil. Maybe we'll never have the complete answer, but the only real answer is to act with faith. And, some fundamentalists and New Agers like to think that God only gives good things, the things I want, the things I defined as good. But wisdom alludes to the fact that God does permit evil in our lives for our own goodness. So this would be heresy to a fundamentalist like Joyce Myers, or the people who wrote the book The Secret, because they believe God only gives you prosperity. If you're a good person, God is going to prosper you with money and happiness. Wisdom literature says something different, that God gives us trials so that we can get more than just things, but wisdom and true life. So God allows evil, not so that we get prosperity and wealth, but a prosperity of life, which is not money. So like Job is wisdom literature. Job says, where shall wisdom be found? Oh, it's found, as Proverbs says, in fear of the Lord. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It tells us that to properly inhabit a world governed by a good God, that a certain type of humility, even fearfulness, is required in trying to discern God's ways. We may not have the full answer. And so it starts with, this is a little bit of wisdom literature, with Abraham and the darkness of God. So this is a story story of Abraham. So you know the story of Abraham. He makes a covenant with God. And his name, Abraham, gets changed to Abraham. His name and identity, he is father of many, is changed by God because the relationship between him and God changed. So God makes a covenant with them. And in the covenant, God's going to share the journey with Abraham. But God, hopefully you guys know what I'm talking about. God takes a journey with Abraham, but God won't tell Abraham how the journey goes. He only gives Abraham enough information to take the next step. Does the same thing with the Virgin Mary. The angel Gabriel just says, know that Elizabeth, just tells her the next step, doesn't tell her the whole plan. Now, this is very disquieting. Or a covenant. That's what a covenant is. A covenant is like a marriage. You're really not sure how it's going to change. When you marry somebody, you don't know the future. All you know is that you're committed. For good or bad, you will stick together. That's a covenant. Does that make sense? A contract, when you enter into a contract, you know the future. Like you really do. You know the future. So a covenant and a contract are completely different because a covenant is open-ended. It doesn't completely define the boundaries of the relationship. A contract does. If you buy a car, it spells out exactly, you know what you're buying. You marry somebody, God knows what you're buying. No, seriously, I'm making a joke, but seriously. Anybody, did you agree to all the suffering, all the, a covenant is like a marriage. The person you marry, they will change many times in the relationship. And there's no telling what will happen. All you know is that you're committed despite the changes. A contract doesn't have that. In many ways, a covenant is an act of faith and hope. So Abraham gets into this covenant with God. God will give him life. God will give him what he wants most, descendants. But God is not even going to spell out how the journey is going to go. And so the point being is that Abraham has to live with a certain amount of darkness, of not knowing how anything's going to turn out. And so these are stories really deals with the mystery of evil. Because, just a little background. Remember, then you have the Sodom and Gomorrah story, right? And God tells Abraham that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham negotiates with God to at least save the innocent. So right there you have this image that God and Abraham are not in this covenant of power. Abraham can plead to God, but it is an ethical covenant. And God makes known that God can be appealed to as a force of justice. So it's kind of odd he has that story. Then the story after that is shocking. Because it's a story of God asking Abraham to kill his own son. Now, this is a very confusing story. God asks Abraham to kill, quote, his son, his only son, your beloved son. So when God says those three things, your only, his son, his only son, his beloved son, God knows what he's asking Abraham to do. He's asking Abraham to sacrifice his future, to sacrifice his very identity. The one thing he wanted was children the most. And Abraham's name means father of many. And if he sacrifices Abraham, he's sacrificing his own identity, his own religious view of himself, his religious view of God, the thing he loves most. And now, this is more than just a story that teaches you to forbid human sacrifices. To sacrifice Isaac means effectively that Abraham must leave his family behind, just as God asked him to do when he left his family behind in Chaldea. But now he has to leave, he did leave his original name and identity, but now he has to leave behind what he loves the most. And in many ways, the call to sacrifice Isaac is a call to sacrifice even more than just Abraham himself. If Abraham just had to sacrifice himself, I think he would have taken that. But to sacrifice Isaac is a higher cost. And the story tells us that God may be more foreign to our notions of right and wrong than when we first realized. Only Abraham knows for sure that his son will come back. So it's odd. God asked him to sacrifice Abraham, but then they travel 3 days. It's always 3 days. He travels 3 days, but he tells them before he leaves. He says, we will return in 3 days. So Abraham really does believe somehow Isaac will survive. The point being is that God is this great mystery. So Abraham will be faithful to God. It seems like he's going to lose everything, but he has faith that somehow, even though he's going to sacrifice Isaac, Isaac will live. And the point being is at times God seems intent on our own destruction. And we can't complain because, like Abraham, everything we are, our name, our identity, our children, it all came from God. Somehow, God possesses us before we even possess ourselves. And so God asks us to do self-destructive things, but somehow in the end, in faith, guarantees us that our life will be spared. And our response in these moments show us how we understand our relationship to God. What's really odd is that just the moments before this story, God was a protector of the innocent, a promoter of justice in the Sodom and Gomorrah story. Or the story of why Abraham is chosen by God is because he's a man of compassion and justice. He offered hospitality to the 3 strangers. So in reward, God says, I will give you greater life. Religion started with this crazy couple who believe in compassion and justice. And the one thing they wanted was a son he wanted and waited for his entire life, Isaac. But now God asks to sacrifice Abraham's love and dreams. And this is the point of this lecture. In the face of that, Abraham not just says yes, but he's silent. Abraham's silence in the face of God's command seems somehow inhuman, as if there's some enormous profoundness in Abraham that he can't communicate. That is, Abraham has some wisdom about life and God's expectations for us that we perceive in his silence, because he can't put it into words. And maybe like Abraham, we don't have the words to describe this mystery that, wow, sometimes God seems intent on our own self-destruction. And after the sacrifice of Isaac, Abraham and Sarah never speak to each other again after this incident. And they're actually not even together until they are put in the same grave. That somehow this was so horrific to Sarah, she never speaks to Abraham again. And so this is what's called the silence of, I know, just for marriages, it should give you a hint. But in all seriousness, this is called the silence of Abraham. And people wonder why about the silence of Abraham. There's no argument between Abraham and Sarah. They just stopped speaking. There's no argument between Abraham and Isaac. There's no argument between God and Abraham. Think of it. Abraham argued with God about Sodom and Gomorrah. But also there's no resentment detected by Abraham against God for such a horrific command. And some things are so profound about justice and evil that they can't be put into words. And be careful of those, the silence of Abraham means be careful of those people, me, who can always completely explain away suffering and evil. Maybe there is no answer, or no answer that we can understand at this time. The ones who may seem to, this is wisdom literature, the ones who always seem to have all the complete answers about good and evil are actually the ones who are wrong. The real insight about justice and evil really may only be the silence of Abraham. The warning of Abraham's life is that God's ways are not our ways. And this is made even more explicit in the book of the book of Job. Job is also wisdom literature. The name Job means foreigner. And so this is amazing. He's not Jewish. And yet at the opening, you know the story of Job. At the opening of the story of Job, he's not of the chosen people. Yet God says he's the holiest of all human beings. It's a really weird story because Satan means Satan, as we would say, but it's Satan. Satan comes up to heaven, and God says, "Oh, did you see my boy Job?" I'm paraphrasing. Satan says, "Yeah, I know Job." He says, "He's the holiest of all humans." And Satan says, "He's only good to you. He only believes in you because you give him good things. Let me have him, and he'll turn against you once he doesn't get good things." And God says, "Oh, I know all things. I know Job. Do your best with Job, but I guarantee he will not turn." So, you know the story. Job loses everything, suffers terribly. Now that should shock you. God allowed it. Allows Job to suffer. To me, that's kind of strange. So Satan enacts all these terrible things on Job. Now, this sounds kind of strange. Satan is a type of angel. Even if he's a dark angel, even if he's Satan, he still has to obey God. And so he suffers. And 3 rabbis, consolers, come to Job. And they're supposed to console, but he refuses the consolation of his friends. And ultimately, his friends tell him, "Curse God and die." That should shock you. Job's comforters give voice in the book of Job to those groups of people attempting to bring a certain logical rationality to Job's punishment. They want to give a rational explanation. So they give 3 different explanations. It all points down to this. If you're suffering in life, clearly you deserve it. And Job is, no, I am a good person. No, you must have committed some sin. Another one is, well, if you're suffering in life, obviously God doesn't like you. Now, people who follow like the Joyce Myers TV fundamentalists, that's their theology. If God loves you, he's going to make you wealthy and healthy and have beautiful hair. No, seriously, or The Secret, that New Age stuff. You know why people are poor? They deserve it. So you get these strange consolations that you still hear the same things today of people trying to give rational explanation to evil that basically is you deserve it. But Job's point is that one may not be able to find a meaning behind the suffering, and yet his 3 friends are wrong. And 3 companions, they, as I said, are still alive today. They give these easy solutions to suffering and evil. And they really promote a blame theology. And especially, I think it's even better because Job is part of the unchurched, and yet he's most faithful. Now, there's this beautiful part. I'll skip it. Finally, Job gets upset with God. Now, the book of Job is just Job complaining mostly to God. He keeps coming back and back and back to God, kind of complaining. Anyhow, so finally he says, well, he has this great prayer that he hopes one day God would send somebody to be his intercessor who would know what it's like to suffer injustice. That whole description is really a description of Christ. And let me just pause for a minute. You do know the story of Isaac is a story of Christ, right? Isaac is 33, Jesus is 33. Isaac is called the beloved son, Jesus is called the beloved son. Isaac is 33. He carries the wood to his own cross, like Jesus. He says, here I am, like Jesus. Anyhow, so Jesus is the fulfillment of the Abraham story. Christ is the fulfillment of the Job story. Because he says, if there's only an intercessor who knew what it's like to suffer injustice. So finally he gets upset with God and really boldly says, God, you are a coward. Answer me. Answer me, you coward. So God appears before Job, and Job falls down on his knees and puts his hand over his mouth. That's the silence of Abraham. Like, once you see God, I don't have any, And God appears and says, oh yeah, you mouthing off to me. And Job says, I didn't know you were that big. And God says, no, Job. You want me to answer your questions. This is great. You want me to answer your questions? I will answer your questions on evil and justice. But first, you answer some questions I have. Why does light behave this way? I don't know. Why do goats behave this way? I don't know. And he walks them all through creation, every time asking the question, why this? Why that? Why does water do this? And each time Job has to say, I don't know, I don't know. And then God says, Job, I would love to answer your questions, but at this time, you don't have the language I can use to explain it to you. So maybe when it comes to evil, we don't have the language God could use to explain it. And anybody who has quick, easy answers to every bit of suffering may be completely wrong. So he asked God, he said, well, what about my 3 friends? Were they right? And he says, no. And their punishment is they'll have to live out that theology. Well, Job does not like that. And Job says, well, is there anything I can do? And God basically says, yes, you can offer up your suffering to save them. So Job does. So in this odd part, Job is the comforter of the 3 friends with a terrible theology. And God gives us really bizarre explanation. He mentions Satan, where the one thing Satan can't understand is suffering. that Satan is far, far too powerful for you, Job. But your suffering for others, it defeats Satan. And in the end, this sounds kind of strange, Satan is defeated because he's defeated in two ways. Remember, the bet was Job would turn. Satan lost. Job never turned. He suffered. But actually, his suffering just made him more in dialogue with God. He prayed even more. Even when he's complaining, it's prayer. And Job, at the end of his suffering, not only is more holy, he was already the holiest, he's more holy, and he saved others through his suffering. So this is kind of this unnamability about the mystery of evil. And I do love the one thing Satan can't understand, how to defeat Satan. He has this idea of a fish hook. Satan thinks people work by power and pleasure. So the one thing that defeats Satan is to really being able to suffer for other people. So this is part of the mystery of God. We can't explain it, but it's Job's suffering that defeated Satan. It's Job's suffering that made him holy. It's Job's suffering that saved other people. And the book seems to be saying that in some ways the wisest course of action may actually be to question, why is there evil? But never know that you'll get the answer on this side of heaven. We should question it, but never accept easy answers. We should question it, and we'll never have the words on this side of heaven to really explain it. But you have to reject the consoler's neat, tidy explanations of evil that never really do any good. It just causes more suffering. And some people think, mistakenly, to think that to question God is a sin. No, God is correct. Job could question and even rage at God for the suffering, but Job never lost faith. So, I have no problem raging against God. But I'm not raging against God, I'm raging to God. And oddly, those who has answers about evil really lack deep faith. Job seems to be telling us that we may not understand evil until we have the perspective of God, but we are obligated to ask important questions. If Satan is doing God's work, then why did God allow evil? Isn't it the same as if God did it himself? And one of the greatest puzzles of this text is that it's not clear that people who most need to hear the lesson about evil can really appreciate it when you're suffering. Do you know what I mean? It's hard to talk to somebody in the midst of their suffering about this. If we think Job is a wisdom text, perhaps it's telling us that real wisdom may be acquired only through intimate first-hand experience of suffering and evil. And so this is the silence of wisdom. Does wisdom always demand such painful sacrifice? Can one gain wisdom solely from armchair reflections without really suffering and making a sacrifice? Can wisdom and spiritual maturity ever be gained without entering into pain? Because I think of Saint Therese of Lisieux, so innocent, so pure, and suffered so much at the end of her life with TB. And yet, she would say, if this is God's will, I want to go through it. Does that make any, I think some wisdom can only be gained through intense suffering. Now, this is at odds. This wisdom literature about evil, it is at odds with other parts of the way the Hebrew Bible looked at evil. Because the prophet Amos, he has this clear theology. His clear theology is, you sow injustice, you weep destruction. That evil we cause on other people will harvest on ourselves. But the story of Abraham and Job serve as a puzzle. Job never inflicted any evil on anybody else. Why is he suffering? It's the very opposite of what the prophet said. So, first, they disturb the faithful's confidence that God's plan for humanity is wholly intelligible and entirely in agreement with our own wishes and aims. Second, wisdom literature forces us to question the recognition of God's terrible mysteriousness. We'll never really be able to understand it. As with Abraham and Job, and the prophet Isaiah tells us that there are no clear and certain knowledge. That sometimes in the face of evil, what's called for is just faithful obedience. We'll never completely get the answer. And so the best response may be just a fearful reverence for God is a wise course of action. The wisest course of action may be to question all evil, but never expect you'll get the great answers. Other wisdom literature, like Ecclesiastes, I love Ecclesiastes, but you've heard my joke about Ecclesiastes, right? Oh, okay. So you have Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And Proverbs, so anyhow, I was having lunch with Estas and Fisher once, and it was just a kind of a meet and greet and trying to figure him out. And he was Hispanic, had a hard life, but brilliant, stunningly brilliant intellect. So I don't know why. We were talking, and somehow wisdom literature came up, and I said, what is your favorite book of the Bible? And he said, Ecclesiastes. What? I mean, so here's my joke about, I was stunned when he said that, because this is my joke about Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a lot like Gail Tooley. Ecclesiastes is like a young, pretty, happy woman who's just joyful and bouncing and isn't like, it has wisdom literature, but it always says things like, you work hard, you'll never go hungry. You know, kind of sweet things. And that's true. You know, you should work hard. You won't go hungry. And just has lots of wisdom. Then the next book is Ecclesiastes. And if wisdom is this young, naive, happy, but wise woman, Ecclesiastes is like a middle-aged man with a cigarette and a brandy tumbler, Pat, who everything wisdom says, Ecclesiastes has the counter-argument. Don't you just love that? So I think it's absolutely hilarious because it's so cynical. So when the guy said, as a teenager, because he was a migrant worker, he would sometimes just sit and read Ecclesiastes. As a teenager? And I said, but it's so cynical. And he says, yeah, that's my view of the world. So, you know, like Proverbs says, work and you'll never go hungry. Ecclesiastes starts by saying, I have seen evil men prosper while the good work hard and suffer. So he says, yes, sometimes evil wins. And yet it alludes to, this sounds kind of strange, Ecclesiastes does say good endures, but good gets most often beaten up by evil. Anyhow, so wisdom literature is the first time it mentions Satan, Satan's fall. Like we know in the Garden of Eden, the snake is Satan, but if all you had the Garden of Eden, you wouldn't know that. It's not till you get to wisdom literature that it mentions Satan. It's also wisdom literature that first mentions the resurrection as well. So why does God wait until wisdom literature to mention Satan? I think it's a really good thing. And I mentioned it before. In the Garden of Eden story about evil, you chose it. You chose not to control your Yetzer Hara. You chose to let your selfishness rule you. I think for children especially, you have to teach them that way. No, there are consequences to your behavior. You have to learn how to master your own emotions. But then you find out that in wisdom literature, there is a war even before human beings were created. and evil pre-exists humanity. So I do like that. So I like the way that God waited to introduce Satan to us because fundamentally it's our choice. But there was this war. Now, Christian wisdom would be, is there a way to avoid pain and evil? We would say no. You have to enter into it. You can't be like the three companions and blame other people for suffering. Wisdom comes to you in uncharted waters. You can't always get it from books and classes. I hate to tell you this. Some wisdom, or one saint said, some graces God can only give through suffering. Or Oscar Romero said, only eyes that have cried can see the glory of God. Some wisdom, like Abraham, only comes when you sacrifice everything. And you can't really explain the silence of Abraham and Job. It's somewhat beyond us. Anyhow, wisdom literature teaches that what may look like evil, and in fact be evil, is being used by God to make us even more holy. And maybe that's why the covenant with God doesn't tell us what's ahead of the road. We have to experience evil. So this odd part is that I think the United States, we don't like wisdom literature. Because, like, death is kept away from family. Do you know 75% of people die in a hospital or a nursing home? Like, I know that sounds kind of strange. Or I have a sister who is like this. Everything with her has to be happy, happy, happy. And so years ago, one of her friends was dying and suffering. And, you know, my mother said, well, you're going to go visit her? And my sister says, no, I like to think of her like she was. You're not protecting her. You're protecting yourself. Does that make sense? It is a form of selfishness that no, all suffering and evil should always be kept far away from me. You know what I mean? Seems strange for somebody who once a year we kiss the cross. Or parents who won't let their kids go to funerals because that's a downer. We've removed the vulnerability to evil in the modern life. You know what I mean? Like, we will never suffer. So wisdom literature, I think there is great wisdom there, but it's not explainable. And wisdom literature introduces this character of Satan. Well, who the heck is Satan? So this sounds kind of strange. Like, we're used to Satan because of wisdom literature. St. Paul talks about this pre-existing fight. So just real quick. There's no real source. This is a 5th century story. But the story is, now I've gone over this before. There's other creatures besides human beings. And I'm not talking about the Canadians. The first created were the tetramorphs, then the seraphim, then the angels, and the tetramorphs guide the seraphim, and the seraphim guide the angels, and the angels, their job is to guide humanity. So every part of creation has work, has responsibility. And humanity's responsibility was to tend the garden and tend each other. But the angels tend us. So when God decides to make human beings, one angel, his name is Lucifer, means light bearer. He was the most beautiful of all the angels. He said, quote, I will not serve. Now when he says, I will